Just as God has power in the infinite, so too he has limited and finite power. This phrase comes to teach us something very fundamental and answers a very basic question. Some people would say, if God is infinite and perfect and has everything, why would he create us then? Or more like, how can he create us? We're limited and finite beings. How on earth? Sorry for the pun. Would he come and create us? Why would God care about us? How in the world are we an expression of God? The phrase in its original text, comes to explain exactly this issue. This teaches us that God is not only infinite and beyond us, he is beyond our definition. This brings us into another Kabbalistic phrase which describes God's infinity as follows. God's infinite light, referring to his expression or energy, reaches all the way up without an end and all the way down to no finish. I'm probably not doing a very good job with the translating, but I think the idea comes through. In the original text, it's Seif Lamayla Mayla Adin Kates and Lamata Mata Adin Tachlis. This represents God's infinite energy reaching all the way up high, as in not getting involved in low and mundane things in our world and limited objects. Instead, it stays infinite and pure and great. But it also reaches all the way down and invests itself and shines, so to speak, even in the lowest places. Lowest places being somewhere like this universe where we don't feel any godliness. There is a total concealment of God. And the reason we don't feel God in this world is because God conceals himself. And that brings us into another Kabbalistic phrase called yesh mi'ayin. That one was a little shorter and it means something from nothing. Now, here an interesting question can pop up, and that is, why would we call ourselves, or anything, something coming from nothing? How can we come from nothing? Everything comes from somewhere, something. But the reason we do still use this term and in Kabbalistic texts is because the way God creates us is by concealing himself. He hides his true infinity and, so to speak, identity in order to go and create something else, which is nothing. He conceals his true infinity and identity to, so to speak, descend and create something other than himself from nothing. In other words, when we look at ourselves and try to understand where we come from, we don't resemble our source. God is concealed in his creation of us, and therefore we call our source nothing. We don't know where we come from. This leads us to another very important Kabbalistic passage, Nimtza bebilti metzius nimtza, which means that God's existence is in a non-existent form. In very simple terms, when we say something exists, that means it takes up space or exists in some sort of definition. God exists beyond definition and doesn't take up any form of space. In fact, he is the space of everything and the definition of everything. In other words, everything that exists has boundaries. If it's physical, the boundaries are time and space, and if it's conceptual, the boundaries are its definition. God is beyond these definitions. He's the creator of the definition and the boundaries and everything that exists within them. If so, it would not be justified to say that God exists in the way anything else exists. This makes it easier to understand the next Kabbalistic phrase, nimna hanimnois. If you would ask me to translate these words literally, I would say he is prevented from prevention. Okay, that sounds funny, and trust me, in the original it sounds a little better, but what it pretty much means is that there is nothing which God cannot do. Questions like, can God create a stone which he cannot lift, come and derive from this phenomenon. There is nothing which God cannot do, which means he could do everything, and then the question becomes, can he do something which he cannot do? This is quite closely related to the first two phrases which we mentioned, in which we said that God has the power not only to act in the infinite, but also in the finite. What's interesting is exactly that is something which we experience every single day. In fact, it's our very own existence right here. We are limited beings which take up time and space, and we are being created by God's infinity. Now, creation means something new which wasn't there before. Like we described earlier, we were created from nothing. But this creates a very interesting paradox. If God is truly infinite and had the ability to do everything, even those things which are impossible, how could it be that we are something new which didn't exist earlier? Hey, so just before we continue, I wanted to disturb you guys for a second and say that if you made it all the way till here, you're probably interested in this content, so I would suggest to subscribe and like this video. How could it be that we are something new which didn't exist earlier? But this is obviously something that only us in our human minds, which were created from nothing by God, have an issue with. God, which is prevented from prevention, does not have this issue. And this all leads us into another Kabbalistic phrase, enigmatic, which means there is nothing but God. That would mean that every single thing, even us, which don't express God, actually are an expression of God. Indeed, we may be an expression of God's ability to express in the finite and the limited, but that is an absolute expression of nothing other than God's true infinity. Kabbalah sheds some light on this issue when it explains the concept of hishavus tmidis, which roughly is translated constant creation. In other words, we are an expression of God because everything is an expression of God, but on the other hand, we don't express God. For us to understand this in our human brains, we could conceptualize this issue with the following logic. Since we don't express God, at least in a revealed way, it turns out that the second God creates us, we must disappear. And that's because God is everything and everywhere, and nothing can be in God's way. So the moment we are created as something which is not an expression of God, we must immediately vanish. And God recreates us immediately. Now, the way this is done is actually very interesting. Remember we said God is beyond definition and He's the creator of all definition? If we think about it for a second, since us humans and everything we know are defined, God first creates the definition of what we are and then creates us. Even more so, God creates us through the definition which was created. Now, this definition is being created by God and coming from within God. It can almost be viewed as a tool which God creates before He creates us in order to create us. Now, if this sounds to you like God needs to create tools before He creates us, that's not exactly what it means, because as we said before, God is prevented from prevention. In other words, God can do anything in any way. But Kabbalah teaches us that the way God created this world is through first creating spiritual dimensions and definitions which later house and have space for more limited and physical dimensions. The details of these spiritual worlds and dimensions are definitely for another video. But for the sake of this video, there is a Kabbalistic phrase called Ihu v'chayu hichad, Ihu v'garmu hichad. He and his energy are one, He and his garments are one. God uses His infinite energy and expression to become one with garments or vessels, pretty much tools to create the next worlds. Now, God is one and unified, and these energies and vessels or tools are one and unified and nullified to God's true infinity and essence. That's how they have the power, after all, to create something from nothing, which is only in the power of God's true infinity, which exists in a non-existing form, and His existence comes from within His own existence, so to speak. In simple terms, what this means is before God created a universe, physical and limited, with absolutely no godly expression, God first created a spiritual and infinite and unified realm within Himself, and only later did he create us from this spiritual realm and in the form, so to speak, of this spiritual universe. It is within this space, this spiritual universe, that another Kabbalistic phrase applies, and that is the one that describes God's knowledge of everything that happens as follows. He knows, he is the knowledge, and he is the known. Hu hamada, hu hayodea, v'hu hayodua, as it is described in its original text. Since we are created in the form of this spiritual and infinite world, there is another Kabbalistic phrase called Adam Mishem Adam Ele Elyon. Adam, which means human, comes from the word similar to above. In other words, what the Kabbalah is trying to tell us, that everything in this universe was created in the form and in a similar process as the original infinite and spiritual universe. Okay guys, that's the end of this video, decoding 10 Kabbalistic phrases, and before I remind you again to subscribe and like this video, I wanted to say that we have another video right here with another 3 Kabbalistic phrases decoding specifically the topic of humans being similar and in the image of the divine.